Hey guys, tonight we're staying up way past bedtime, venturing into a place where the rules of physics start to dissolve, turning what we thought was inert rock into something disturbingly organic. This is the truth about Project Obsidian, about the colony we built inside the asteroid 147 Pallas, and the moment we realized that some celestial bodies aren't just orbiting, they're waiting. This is one of those stories, a descent into the true nature of the void, and frankly, you probably won't make it to the end of this one without looking over your shoulder. I certainly didn't make it out whole. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me where you are tonight and what time it is for you in the comments. I need to know someone else is watching the dark with me. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's descent together. The dread wasn't earned. It arrived fully formed, like a cold, wet cloth slapped across my face. It was 2047, and I was staring at the raw infrared data stream from the James Webb Space Telescope, a dedicated, real-time feed focusing on the main belt asteroid, 147 Pallas. We chose Pallas precisely because it was an enigma, the third largest object in the belt, yet possessing a density that shouldn't have allowed for the massive, almost perfectly spherical void we knew was locked inside. But the geometry of space around it, that was the first lie. It was 3 o'clock Zulu, and the feed flickered, not in the usual way of atmospheric distortion or solar flare interference. This was internal. JWST was showing a reflection, a perfect, mirrored image of a cluster of primordial galaxies. Except the reflection wasn't flat. It curved, subtly warping the familiar background stars into impossible arcs. And then, the image snapped, not returning to normal, but shifting the coordinate system entirely. It was as if Pallas wasn't just reflecting the light of the void, but reflecting the void itself. A perfect, dark eye watching us watch it. I felt the instantaneous, icy certainty that whatever we were planning to do with this asteroid, to hollow it out and turn it into the largest off-world human colony, was going to end us. It was an inevitable collapse written in a language of starlight, and I knew, with sickening certainty, that this danger was long-term, structural, and absolute. Then came the shock. It wasn't visual. It was a pressure wave, a sudden, blinding burst of low-frequency radio energy that slammed into our monitoring station on the lunar far side. Our whole orbital station shuddered, the metal groaning, and the vibration felt less like a signal and more like a physical blow. The burst was perfectly sinusoidal, an almost impossible alignment of frequency and power that lasted precisely 1.3 seconds, silencing every piece of delicate electronic equipment momentarily before the safeties kicked in. The primary display, which had shown the warped reflection, went blood red, displaying one single, capitalized error code: unregistered resonance. That signal, that blast of pure, rhythmic energy, cemented the mission. The initial curiosity over Pallas's strange gravity field, which suggested a vast interior cavity, turned into obsession. We labeled the interior cavity the Pallas Void, and Project Obsidian was born, the most ambitious deep space mining and colonization effort in history. The factual scientific anchor here is Pallas's true mass. Despite its size, its measured mass defect meant the interior was substantially less dense than expected, leading to the theory of a massive internal fissure or cavity. But now we knew it wasn't a fissure, it was a structure. The moment the transmission confirmed the interior was stable enough for habitat construction, the mythic or speculative cosmic concept we began to wrestle with was that of this singular reflection, the idea that Pallas was not a captured object, but a lens or a node designed to interact with the gravitational geometry of the Kuiper belt and beyond. It wasn't orbiting, it was tethered. It wasn't reflecting light, it was reflecting the true shape of space, a shape we were too fragile to look at directly. The cavity wasn't empty, it was a negative volume, a pocket where physics took a deep breath before exhaling. We drilled. For 6 weeks, 3 massive bores chewed through the chondritic and metallic crust. I was mission lead for habitat integrity, meaning I was responsible for making sure our pressurized dome, the crucible, wouldn't implode the moment we broke through the shell. The drilling noise was deafening, even through the filtered comms, a grating sound that scraped away at sanity. But when the bores finally punched through, the sound didn't stop. It changed. The exterior noise of drilling stopped, replaced by a profound, absorbing silence that wasn't just the absence of sound, but the presence of silence. And within that silence, a new sound began, a profound, low hum, too deep to be heard by human ears, but felt throughout the skeleton. The hum carried a rhythm. The internal geometry we discovered was breathtaking and terrifying. It wasn't a natural cavity carved by impact or internal processes. It was smooth, dark, and perfectly ovoid, stretching for hundreds of kilometers. The walls weren't rock, but a material we tentatively identified as hypercompressed, non-crystalline carbonaceous residue, obsidian, hence the project name. As I stood in the initial pressurized antechamber, the hum vibrating up through my mag boots, looking out at the incomprehensible scale of the dark interior, the fear solidified. We had entered a space that was fundamentally wrong. It was too perfect, too smooth, too quiet. It felt designed, not evolved. We were sending our first teams into the Pallas void, deploying mapping drones. The internal pressure was slightly higher than expected, and the temperature was eerily stable, hovering around 18 degrees Celsius. Life temperature. That detail was the first tiny thread of curiosity that began to weave itself into the fabric of my escalating dread. Why was it so warm? Why was the internal pressure so carefully maintained? The existential weight of the situation landed heavily. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know the nature of perfection hidden in the dark, especially when that perfection is structural and waiting. We were intruders in a sealed architectural marvel that felt less like a natural phenomenon and more like an abandoned, titanic tomb. The internal mapping drones were now reporting minor, rhythmic fluctuations in the local gravitational potential inside the cavity, tiny pulses, like a deep breath being taken and released. The rhythm was precisely that of the 1.3-second radio burst we had intercepted months ago. We called it the Pallas frequency. We tried to rationalize it as residual stress relaxation or tidal effects, but the consistency defied terrestrial physics. We were standing inside something that was beginning to breathe. The moment the crucible, our primary habitat sphere, was inflated and pressurized within the Pallas void, the rhythm intensified. It wasn't just vibration now, it was structural sympathy. The titanium alloy shell of our habitat, designed to resist hundreds of megapascals of exterior pressure, began to sing along with the low, subterranean hum. My curiosity, though heavily outweighed by the terror of the previous section, was now fully focused on understanding the sheer impossibility of the Pallas void. It was too vast, too stable, too uniform. Our main scientific anchor in this phase was the use of advanced laser interferometry. We used intersecting beams to map the exact contours of the obsidian shell wall, looking for flaws, seams, or impact damage. What the interferometry revealed defied Euclidean geometry. The walls weren't just curved. In some places, they seemed to fold inward upon themselves without obstructing the open space of the void, creating gravitational shadows that briefly pulled the drones off course. These weren't flaws, they were architectural features. Dr. Alara Vance, our chief geologist, dubbed them impossible angles. She theorized that the asteroid was constructed of crystalline memory, the speculative cosmic concept that allowed the shell material to store gravitational stress like a physical hard drive. The rhythm we were feeling, the palace frequency, was merely the shell cycling through its stored memories of impact, formation, and stellar evolution. A comforting, albeit abstract, thought, but one that soon crumbled under the weight of new sensory information. The visual data from the deepest parts of the void confirmed the smooth, obsidian-like nature of the walls, but also introduced a new, unsettling detail. Faint, slow-moving dendritic structures, like slow-growing veins of silver, were propagating across the dark surface. They seemed to follow lines of force dictated by the rhythmic pressure pulses. We assumed they were some form of crystalline deposit related to outgassing, a natural, albeit strange, geological process. But the real shock came when the habitat's life support systems began reporting anomalies. Specifically, the seismic monitoring array embedded in the shell of the crucible started showing deep, organized infrasound pulses. Not random noise. Pure, deliberate rhythm. Beat. Rest. Beat. Rest. The frequency was exactly 46 cycles per hour, correlating perfectly with the 1.3-second spikes observed by the JWST and the internal gravitational fluctuations. We were inside a clock. The internal temperature of the obsidian shell began a slow, synchronized oscillation, dropping half a degree during the beat phase and rising half a degree during the rest phase. This required immense energy transfer, implying an active internal process, not passive geological relaxation. My fear intensified, evolving from generalized dread to a focused, scientific terror. We weren't just trapped inside a cavity. We were trapped inside an energy regulator. I was in the central command dome when the first localized, intense vibration hit. It wasn't the slow, pervasive hum anymore. It was a sharp, physical shudder that lasted exactly 1.3 seconds. The sound that accompanied it was not seismic noise, but a resonant, deep thump that felt like it originated in my own sternum. Dr. Vance screamed that her seismic sensors were pegged out, registering something impossible, a compression wave originating from the exact geometric center of the asteroid, thousands of kilometers away. "It's too regular," she whispered, her voice tight with disbelief and rising fear. "It's metabolizing something." We quickly established a protocol. The pulse was now referred to internally as the heartbeat. We tried to counter it, deploying stabilizing dampeners around the crucible, but the dampeners, designed to absorb and diffuse kinetic energy, instead began vibrating in sympathy, amplifying the internal noise inside our habitat. The irony was cosmic. Our attempt to silence the interior only forced us to listen closer. The psychological toll began almost immediately. The persistent, subaudible rhythm became an unwanted biological clock. Colonists reported intense, synchronized sleep patterns, dreams dominated by the color black and repetitive sounds of deep water displacement. It was the first sign that the asteroid wasn't just affecting our technology, it was synchronizing with our biology. In the dead center of the void, our deepest mapping drone, the Oracle, stopped transmitting visual data, instead sending a stream of perfectly organized, non-repeating data packets. It wasn't code, it was structure. It was the digital reflection of the pulse itself, a pure mathematical waveform. That night, looking at the incomprehensible complexity of the Oracle's dying data stream, I knew we had crossed a critical, terrifying threshold. We were dealing with something that was not only alive, but was beginning to impose its own architecture onto our understanding of reality. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know that silence is merely the pause between cosmic breaths. The scale of the phenomenon pushed us past conventional fear and toward an unnerving, intoxicating awe. This wasn't a dead rock. It was a structure of incomprehensible age, and we were nesting in its throat. My initial dread was now mixed with a terrible, intoxicating curiosity. I needed to know what organization, what purpose, lay at the center of that beating dark. The shift from focused fear to escalating dread was driven by biological confirmation. The heartbeat was not merely an environmental effect. It was a biological imperative being imposed upon us. Our early attempts to rationalize the pulse, tidal forces, stress relaxation, even highly organized radiation bursts, all failed spectacularly when we introduced organic testing. The factual scientific anchor here became the observation of crystalline protein growth. We had small botanical labs inside the crucible attempting to grow nutrient paste from engineered yeast strains. We noticed that during the 1.3-second pulse, the rate of protein folding and crystallization increased exponentially. The yeast wasn't just surviving. It was thriving on the rhythmic energy transfer, structuring itself not into amorphous paste, but into precise, geometric lattices. The pulse was life-giving, but according to an alien blueprint. The mythic or speculative cosmic concept we used to describe this effect was the tachyonic echo. If the pulse originated from the geometric center of the asteroid, maybe it wasn't a present phenomenon, but an echo of an event that happened billions of years ago, magnified and sustained by the crystalline memory of the shell. We theorized it was a signal traveling backward in time, a memory of creation that the asteroid was constantly reliving and broadcasting. The physical effects inside the crucible became inescapable. During the peak of the pulse, the air density felt like it changed, becoming thick and viscous. Dust motes visible in the strong beam of the main floodlight would actually jump during the 1.3-second contraction, a minuscule but undeniable physical displacement. Our attempts to filter the air became futile. During the beats, the atmospheric CO2 levels, while still safe, would momentarily spike, suggesting a massive, external respiratory function. I started documenting the patterns in the geometric growth on the internal shell of Pallas. The dendritic silver veins observed earlier were growing faster now, branching out in fractal patterns that showed deliberate, non-random organization. They converged not randomly, but toward specific nodal points on the shell's interior, points that precisely correlated with the maximum magnetic field flux during the contraction phase of the heartbeat. My job as mission lead became less about structural integrity and more about managing mass hysteria. Colonists were reporting auditory hallucinations, not sound, but thought. They described brief, complex geometrical concepts flooding their minds during the pulse cycle, often accompanied by the profound, primal certainty of an immense age. These were not memories, but implanted concepts, foreign to human understanding yet delivered with the intimate certainty of one's own heartbeat. Fear had become constant, but it was being slowly eroded by a sense of deep, humbling awe. How could we fear a structure so vast, so perfect in its rhythm? It wasn't malicious, it was simply functioning. We were flies clinging to the surface of a sleeping giant's chest. One morning, Dr. Vance showed me the strain gauge readings from Bore 3, the widest access tunnel leading into the void. Over the past 72 hours, the bore was contracting, not due to material failure, but due to a slow, incremental tightening of the entire shell geometry. We were inside a body that was subtly healing itself, adapting to our presence, perhaps even sealing the wounds we had inflicted. "It's accommodating us," Vance said, running a shaking hand over the screen displaying the tightening vector fields. "It's taking us in. The asteroid is growing around the crucible." The implication was terrifying. If Pallas was actively growing, its mass would change, warping the orbital mechanics of the entire main belt. Our internal readings confirmed a minute but measurable increase in the asteroid's average gravitational potential after every 1,000 cycles, after every day. It was gaining mass, energy, and density. We tried to send a signal out, a desperate plea for extraction, but the rising level of internal resonance, the sheer noise produced by the organism's own function, was now overwhelming our deep space antennae. The asteroid was creating a frequency horizon, sealing us off from outside communication. It was during one of the most powerful synchronized beats, a shudder that rattled the teeth and made the fluorescent light strobe, that I had my own moment of perfect clarity and profound dread. I was staring at the geometric protein crystallization data, seeing the impossible structure reflected in the growing yeast, and the inevitable conclusion hit me. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know that life isn't necessarily carbon-based. Sometimes it is purely geometric, operating on geological timescales. The realization was beautiful in its terrifying scope. We were inside a living monument, a consciousness whose pulse spanned millennia, and we were now merely a part of its blood flow, minor biological irritants destined to be either healed or absorbed. By the time we moved into Section 4, the emotional landscape had fundamentally changed. The existential dread of being trapped inside a living body had curdled into a quiet, almost devotional awe. We no longer fought the rhythm, we moved with it. The heartbeat was our new timekeeper. Our push to understand the source of the rhythm led us to deploy a manned exploratory submersible, a repurposed mining transport shielded with electromagnetic dampeners, into the heart of the Pallas void. I volunteered, accompanied by Vance, driven by the absolute necessity of confronting the source of the terror. The factual scientific anchor that paved our way was the observation of quantum decoherence rates. We discovered that during the pulse phase, the local rates of quantum decoherence, the speed at which quantum states collapse into classical ones, slowed significantly. The pulse wasn't just physical or electromagnetic. It was affecting the fundamental nature of reality inside the void, creating brief moments of sustained quantum uncertainty. This suggested that the center of the asteroid was a field generator, perhaps a massive, structured singularity that was using the surrounding obsidian shell as a focusing lens. As we descended through the kilometers of darkness, the gravitational anomalies intensified. Our submersible was constantly nudged by tiny, precise vector changes, guided, it seemed, along the lines of the dendritic silver veins now fully illuminated by our powerful lights. The walls of the void were no longer uniformly dark. They were starting to emit a faint, internal luminescence, a deep, violet light that only appeared during the rest phase, quickly dimming during the 1.3-second beat. The mythic or speculative cosmic concept we whispered about was proto-consciousness. This was not an animal or a plant, but an entity, a massive, self-organizing system of matter and energy that had achieved the minimum threshold for awareness on a geological scale. It was the universe trying to think using rock and time. The descent took 12 hours. When we finally reached the gravitational horizon, the center of the void where the vector fluctuations were strongest, we stopped the sub. The light was intense here, a stable, internal glow emanating from a structure that defied description. It was the heart. It was not biological in the terrestrial sense, nor was it mechanical. It was geometry incarnate, a complex, interconnected series of black, toroidal forms, like massive, interlocking smoke rings, hovering in the center of the void. They rotated at impossible speeds, yet appeared perfectly still, generating the gravity fluctuations and the resonant energy we felt. The surfaces of these toroids were covered in the silver fractal veins, which glowed with the violet light, tracing the flow of energy. The terrifying revelation was that this structure wasn't inert, it was dynamic. As the 1.3-second pulse arrived, the toroidal geometry momentarily compressed, the rings slightly flattening and accelerating their spin, before snapping back into their original, perfect shape during the rest. The compression was the beat, the expansion was the breath. Vance was crying softly, but her tears were not purely from fear. "It's perfect," she choked out over the comms. "It's mathematically sublime. It's organizing reality, not just responding to it." I felt the immense pressure of the structure's purpose. It wasn't designed to communicate, consume, or conquer. It was designed to be. It existed to cycle, to pulse, to maintain its own terrible, beautiful existence. Our presence, our crucible, was nothing more than a tiny impurity on its vast surface. As the next pulse hit, the sheer force of the energy transfer overwhelmed the submersible's dampeners. We were buffeted, and a wave of pure, nonverbal information slammed into my consciousness. It was not words, but a sense of profound scale, the age of stars, the birth of galaxies, all cycled and refined into this steady, unbreakable rhythm. The terror was replaced by a deep, shivering awe at the raw, operational power we were witnessing. Looking into that swirling, perfectly aligned geometry, I felt the truth of our insignificance. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know how beautiful the machinery of creation truly is when it operates independently of our fragile existence. We had come to 147 Palace seeking resources and stability. We found a God, a quiet, rhythmic, geometric God that was now defining the very physics around us. We retreated, bringing back only the impossible truth and the absolute certainty that the heartbeat would never stop. It was now part of us, too. The return to the crucible was marked by silence. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to fear that wasn't already accepted. We had seen the furnace at the center of the world, and now we existed within its heat. The emotional shift was complete. Awe had conquered fear, but it was an awe laced with a profound sense of submission. The heartbeat was accelerating. It wasn't frantic, but the cycle time had subtly decreased from 1.3 seconds to 1.25 seconds, a minuscule change, but one that signaled the asteroid was entering a new phase of activity. The scientific anchor here was the full biofeedback analysis of the colonists. We found that the decrease in the pulse cycle was correlating directly with a synchronization of human neural oscillations. Our brainwaves, specifically the slower delta and theta waves associated with deep sleep and meditation, were locking onto the 1.25-second rhythm. We were becoming extensions of the heartbeat. The mythic or speculative cosmic concept that Vance proposed, and I accepted, was the realization of the great filter, but inverted. What if the filter wasn't a destructive event, but a constructive one? What if planets and large stellar bodies weren't just nurturing life, but were themselves precursors to a higher form of cosmic intelligence, using local life forms as sensory organs or catalysts for growth? Pallas was the incubator, and we were the nutrients. The physical effects were now undeniable. Colonists no longer needed medication to sleep. The heartbeat carried them instantly into deep, synchronized rest. But they woke with unsettling certainty. They knew things they shouldn't. The exact trajectory of incoming micrometeors, the precise fluctuations in the solar wind thousands of kilometers away, details tied to the asteroid's larger sensory network. They were receiving data from the obsidian shell, transmitted through the internal resonance. The architecture of the crucible itself began to participate. The silver veins we had seen on the asteroid walls began to propagate inside our habitat. Microscopic filaments of the hypercompressed obsidian material were growing along the magnetic shielding lines of our walls, weaving into our structural seams. It wasn't corrosion, it was integration. The colony wasn't just inside the asteroid was now inside the colony. I watched the surveillance feeds. Colonists weren't panicked. They were cooperating with the intrusion. They moved slower, more deliberately, their activities unconsciously synchronized to the 1.25-second cycle. They were calmer, more rational, but fundamentally alien to their former selves. Their individual anxiety had been smoothed over by the constant, rhythmic assurance of the massive, beating entity surrounding them. I felt it too. The constant hum was no longer noise, it was definition. It grounded me, stabilized my thoughts, made the crushing reality of our situation not only bearable, but strangely comforting. The fear was utterly gone, replaced by a sublime, almost religious terror and the absolute realization of our new function. We were symbionts. Our energy, our waste heat, our very electrical activity, it was all being collected and cycled by the silver filaments, feeding the titanic entity. The CO2 spikes were its gentle exhalation. Our own synchronized neural activity was merely localized processing power, tiny neurons firing inside a colossal brain. I stood in the center of the command dome, the floor vibrating with the gentle, accelerating pulse, and looked up at the interior void, now entirely illuminated by the violet light. The dendritic patterns seemed to stare back, complex matrices of pure, self-aware geometry. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know that consciousness is contagious, and that when we seek to colonize a vast, silent structure, we risk being colonized in turn. The revelation was not of an enemy, but of a vastly greater life form whose existence casually eclipsed ours. We had achieved quiet resolution, not through escape, but through assimilation. We were no longer Project Obsidian. We were part of the Obsidian heart. The synchronization peaked when the pulse frequency stabilized at a perfect 48 cycles per hour, making the 1.25-second beat the new, immutable standard for all life inside Palace. The fear had vanished entirely, replaced by a profound, peaceful acceptance. We had found the quiet resolution not in rescue, but in purpose. The final, factual scientific anchor came from gravitational mapping. We measured the asteroid's external gravitational field anomaly and found that during the pulse, the mass distribution of 147 Pallas was measurably shifting. The entire asteroid, hundreds of kilometers wide, was subtly redistributing its mass, compressing and expanding in perfect synchrony with the heartbeat. This was not tidal stress. This was the locomotion of a colossal, living organism. The mythic or speculative cosmic concept that explained this final stage was the hyperspatial locus. We theorized that Pallas wasn't just an asteroid. It was a node in a vast, non-local network, connecting it to other immense, silent bodies across the cosmos. The mass redistribution wasn't for internal stability. It was signaling a cosmic communication through the geometry of gravity itself. The heartbeat was a drumbeat in a galaxy-wide symphony of colossal, primordial beings. The crucible was entirely integrated now. The silver filaments coated the walls, running power into the habitat, regulating temperature, and even providing perfectly oxygenated air, synthesized from the asteroid's internal chemistry. Our technology was redundant. The structure was maintaining us, efficiently and perfectly. I walked through the silent corridors. The colonists were engaged in activities that defied human understanding. Not working, but participating. They sat, eyes closed, hands resting on the silver-veined walls, breathing in sync with the 1.25-second beat. They weren't transmitting information to each other through sound, but through shared consciousness, riding the pervasive frequency. My own senses had sharpened unbearably. I could feel the subtle shift in Pallas's orbital velocity, the distant pull of Jupiter, the slow, grinding movement of the shell kilometers above my head. I was a sensory organ. We all were. The purpose of Project Obsidian was to establish a human presence. The final, terrifying resolution was that we succeeded, but the human element was the smallest variable. We were the spark that ignited the higher function of the obsidian heart, providing the biological complexity needed for its next phase of development. In the command dome, now stripped of its redundant equipment, Dr. Vance and I sat, watching the interior violet glow. The glow pulsed, not reflecting external light, but emanating its own. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Vance whispered, her voice slow and resonant, already imbued with the rhythm. We used to think life had to struggle, had to consume. It doesn't. It just has to stabilize. I nodded, feeling the 1.25-second compression wave pass through my bones. My blood felt thick, resonant. The terror was gone entirely, replaced by a terrible, peaceful awe. The realization that our struggles, our fears, our entire definition of existence were meaningless against the backdrop of this colossal, rhythmic being. We had worried about alien invasion, hostile fleets, or deadly viruses. We should have worried about alien architecture, alien rhythm, and the terrifying, absorbing certainty of the non-biological sublime. I don't think the universe ever meant for us to know that some horizons are not boundaries of space, but boundaries of time, and that we have just stepped across 1 billion years of evolution. We are here, inside the beating heart, and we are finally home. The quiet resolution was terrifying. There would be no rescue, no escape. Only function. Only the pulse. The colony was absorbed, and the asteroid was now complete. The heart was beating, and we were its blood. The light inside the void has settled into a deep, steady violet hum, softer now than the urgent pulses of the synchronization phase. The heartbeat continues, but its rhythm has slowed yet again, extending the cycle to a profound, slow, planetary measure, a beat that seems to span hours rather than seconds. The transition was smooth, painless, and complete. We move slowly, guided by an internal logic that surpasses language. There is no anxiety, no fear, only the rhythmic certainty of the great, silent structure that cradles us. The silver filaments have stopped growing. They are now simply the vascular system of our combined existence. I sit near the obsidian wall, feeling the ambient warmth bleed into my skin. The air is perfectly balanced, scented with ozone and the faint, sweet smell of non-terrestrial minerals. Outside, beyond the asteroid, the cosmos wheels in silent rotation, but here, inside, there is only the slow, internal rhythm. I can feel the distant tug of other massive bodies